Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple, a practical podcast that guides clinical leaders and healthcare managers to create trust and support with their teams. I'm your host, Trace Hobson. Join me for weekly interviews, practical tools, and inspiring transformational stories of bringing people together in healthcare. Now, let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Space Made Simple. This is going to be a presentation that I am planning on doing for a safety conference that I'm going to be a part of in the coming weeks. And so I thought I'd share it with you here as well, because it gives you a great overview of how to generate a safe space, especially in intense environments where you're trying to do that to achieve a result. Could be related to safety, compliance, risk management, or it just might be your team that you're working with and you're trying to create a result under pressure and wondering how to do that. Well, this presentation will help you to know exactly what to do. It'll give you some really clear, concise steps to be able to generate a safe space that's psychologically safe, but also neurobiologically safe. And then it also will give you some actions at the end that you can do to start to implement this into your day-to-day work with yourself as well as with your team. So I trust that this will serve you, and I look forward to sharing it with you. So without further ado, let's get right into today's show. The title of today's presentation is The Safety Reset. How do you create a safety culture that everybody wants to be a part of? So have you ever walked into a safety meeting full of great ideas only to leave feeling like no one was really on board? Well, there's a core issue that is really important to understand, that without psychological and neurobiological safety, it's impossible to get buy-in that actually lasts, that's sustainable. The main issue is that people don't feel safe enough to engage or buy into safety initiatives. Without that sense of safety, compliance and collaboration are impossible. Now, we often blame busyness or lack of commitment when people don't buy in, but the real problem is lack of psychologically safe spaces. Without that, engagement and buy-in simply won't happen. And it doesn't matter how good the data is or your arguments are, your business case, if people don't feel safe, they won't connect and engage. In fact, they can't. Now, I have a couple of really quick examples of this. The first one I'll start with is the most intense and dangerous safety environment that I've ever experienced in my life. And that was being a single dad of 3 teenage girls. Trust me, I needed buy-in a lot and was not getting it. Now, at that time in the history of our family, we were really struggling for different reasons. I was working very long hours, between 60 and 80 hours a week, and my daughters were all sort of going in different directions. And we were struggling to try and get through sort of those awkward years where they were transitioning from preteen through teen to adult. And quite frankly, some of the things that they were doing were terrifying for me. And so that was a time in my life as a dad where I was trying to get them to, listen to reason and giving them great advice that they were simply not listening to. And it didn't matter how many, real examples and logic was attached to what I was saying. They simply did not, they were not, and they could not listen. Now that I look back in hindsight, because they didn't feel safe around me. And, that was a theme in my life and my leadership at that time. Then at work at the same time, I was leading an organization of 150 people that was throughout British Columbia. And it was a really intense environment where safety and compliance were very demanding. In fact, if we didn't have all of the safety checks handled properly, we would get kicked off of job sites or not even get access to some of the heavy industrial sites that we needed to go on. Now you times that by 50, 60 different crews that are going into different locations all over the province. And that was an intense and pressure-packed environment because at that time I felt like if anybody doesn't have the right things or hasn't done all that they're supposed to, then that's my fault. That as the director of operations, then that reflects on me. And you would think that when the livelihood that we all relied on was connected to whether or not we had done all of the training and done all of the safety and compliance things that we needed to do, that people would just do that. You would think that, but that is not what happened. Does that sound familiar to you? Have you ever had an example where you had all of the right data and still people, it was like they couldn't hear you or they just didn't buy in, even though the business case was sound, it made sense, and you leave there thinking like, what is wrong with these people? Or you think, what's wrong with me? Why is it that I can't actually get them to listen? Now, what I realized at home with my daughters and at work was that the rules, data, or logic weren't cutting it. They weren't enough. And it became more about creating a sense of safety. And without that, no one was buying in, which is always ironic to me in safety intense environments where people are always talking about and striving for safety, but that they're actually not feeling safe. Now, as the pressure increased for me at that time, I became reactive, driven, and intense. And I toggled between being resistant, reclusive, and even retaliatory. So I blamed external factors. Like it's not about all of, I blamed external factors. And then eventually it actually hit me like a ton of bricks. Now, this was 16 years ago, and I found myself in a training for social workers, counselors, psychologists, and clinicians that work in mental health and in systems work. And I took this course called Satir Transitional Systems Therapy. The truth is, I had talked my way into that course because at that time I was an executive in a leadership role. I wasn't working in the way that any of the people in the room were working, but I was desperate. There was things going on at home that were really stressful, and there was fragmentation there, and there was things going on at work as well that were also fragmented. And so, you know what? I through conversations with friends, somebody had suggested after hearing what I was going through that, this might actually really help you. And so I looked at the information. I thought, yeah, systemic transformation, I want to see that happen. And I definitely want to see that happen in my family with my daughters and in my team. So when I arrived at this place, I was not prepared. I was in the deep end of the pool. Like I walked into the room, and first of all, there was this big circle of chairs. And I thought, what? This is not a classroom. What's going on? So I sat down in the chair. I try to, I'm usually early. So I sat there, feeling a strong sense of anxiety as I watch people walking in. Hey, what do you do for a living? And there's a clinical counselor, a psychologist, a university student studying psychology, a social worker, a clinician, on and on it went. There was another 25 people other than me. And then the person comes in to start the class and they sit down and they don't say anything for like the first 2 minutes they're sitting there. Everybody quiets down and then they ask a question. Who are you and what do you want? And then they sat there and let that hang for about another 3 minutes. And I was completely dysregulated. I was having a complete panic attack at that point and trying to hold it down and just take deep breaths. So then they wanted to go around the circle, and each person was saying, who they were and what they wanted from this course. Man, okay, so I don't remember what my answer was. I was way too dysregulated. I feel a little dysregulated telling the story right now. And so as I look back though, the truth is what I was really there to do was to try and solve the problems going on in my family with my daughters and with my team, and to actually like fix that. I was looking for another tactic, another strategy. And what I discovered that day, right from the very beginning, was that this had nothing to do with any of those people or situations or circumstances. This was actually about me. And that was the beginning of a journey for me into my own unaddressed anxiety and systemic distress, and the things that were causing in me an inability to be present, to be with people, to listen deeply, or to be able to actually access creativity and collaboration and social connection in a way that was in my day-to-day work. In fact, that was the core of what I discovered in that course, and it's also what I needed to discover and start to practice as an individual leader, as a dad, as a human being. What I learned and discovered, bottom line, is that I didn't feel safe. My daughters didn't feel safe. My colleagues didn't feel safe. And it was clear that the way I approached people was driving resistance at that time without my even knowing it. That was the beginning of me learning that how I approach others matters more than the safety message that I had in those circumstances where I was trying to get people to do things related to safety. And if people don't feel safe around you, they won't feel safe enough to engage, no matter how good the safety measures are. Now we're going to experiment with the SOP3. It's a three-step process for generating psychologically and neurobiologically healthy and safe space for yourself and in ways that become invitational to others around you. Now, as I mentioned, this has been forged in the laboratory of my life and leadership over the last 16 years. And full transparency, I've been able to validate the efficacy of this approach through research and field testing. It's true. But one really practical reason why this tool works is because I spent the last 16 years absolutely sucking at this at times. And through repeated trial and error and hundreds, if not thousands, of hours and failures, I believe that it's been field tested enough that it will bring some value to you. So the SOP3 is made up of three fundamental components. The first one is present and presence. And so, even as you're listening to this, there's probably moments in time where you are aware, you're present, you're listening. And then there's other moments when you're absolutely checked out, you're not. And that's just normal. That's the way it is in our day and age. And when you think about this, there are so many distractions that we have going on all the time in our pocket with our phone, emails, demands in our personal lives, in our professional lives. And in certain sectors, this is even more the case when you have intense systemic disruption that's going on in a sector, say like healthcare. But in this model, the first step is to really understand that it's a conscious choice to be present. And as you breathe into your body and you take a deep breath into your gut, you actually can't be anywhere else other than the moment you're in. And then when you exhale and then take another deep breath, and you do that enough, you can start to become present, and then that starts to become presence. So present with a hard T at the end is like a decision that you've got to make moment to moment, that is a constant challenge or invitation that's going on all day long as we navigate our lives. And then when you make that choice and you become present, and then you stay in that moment with somebody or in a situation, and you continue to choose to be present, it starts to actually spill or ripple over into being in presence. And when you're in presence, you can start to notice the multidimensionality of life and being human in this world. There are many things going on all at once. And so even if you're with another person and you're in presence, you can notice what's happening with you, and then you can notice what's happening with them, and you can notice even information that's around you both as well. And so as you practice choosing to be present, and then you allow that space to continue to be a practice area, it starts to become presence as well, giving you access to more information. So step one is to be present and notice that you can actually access a more multidimensional experience as you practice being present, that I'll call presence. The second fundamental step in this model is to then listen. And when you listen and you breathe down in your body, I'm talking about an embodied listening that accesses a larger bandwidth of information than just what you hear with your ears. It's actually listening with your whole body and really embodying that moment that you're in so that you can listen with your whole body and also listen on four channels of information. Now, I'm not going to get into the four channels. That's a different tool that I've created for safe space systemic coaching for leaders and teams. But just suffice it to say that there is a multidimensionality to the way that we listen. And that when we listen, we start in channel one, which is us. And so you're listening there. There's another channel, it's other people that are around you. And that's channel two: people, places, projects, processes. You're listening to those other that other channel of information um, over there, wherever there is, and whatever's over there is what you're listening to. And then there's channel three, the space between you and them. And that's as far as I'll go with that. But embodied listening is after choosing to be present, being in presence, and then listening at the same time. You're listening to what's going on inside of you. You're listening to what's going on with people and what they might be saying. But then there's even information under the words that you can start to hear as well. Now, the reason why this is really important is because in high pressure, high stress situations, you need access to as much information as you can get. And so, if you're present and you're practicing presence and then you're listening in an embodied way, you're going to get much more data than if you're in a reactive state. And so, that's the second fundamental step of the SOP3. The third step is to begin to notice curiosity as a superpower. Now, curiosity is a stance that we can take. It's an intentional way of being that lets go of having to have the answers to something and really leans into, um, the openness to something new, being curious about what's happening, even though I might have a reaction to what's happening, or I might have my own opinions or judgments. It's an intentionally letting go of that and doing an inquiry in that moment that you're in to really begin to tap into curiosity. Now, as you practice this, this can get much more concrete in terms of the kinds of questions that you can ask and tools and exercises that you can do. But right now, I want to keep it as simple as possible and just say that powerful questions represents curiosity. And when you practice being present, step one, and then embodied listening, step two, and leaning into curiosity, step three, as you practice those fundamental moves within this particular tool, it then becomes a generator for a safe space inside of you. Now, this is a space that is actually already on board within you that you're accessing no matter what's going on. And so think in terms of the times in your life when you've had a moment where everything was maybe happening around you chaotically, but you were able to just kind of tap into the eye of the storm and slow down and notice everything differently. And sort of, it's almost like time slows down in that eye of the storm in the middle of the hurricane, and you're able to watch everything around you in a different way. It's because you've inadvertently tapped into and started to generate a safe space inside of you. Now, this is something that we do innately. It's a human characteristic, and it's also something that we've been conditioned to forget. And so we need to begin to practice being present, practicing presence, listening in an embodied way, and then leaning into curiosity and practicing all three of those fundamentals so that it generates a safe space within us. Now, this is a fundamentally different kind of space than talking about psychological safety or physical safety. It's actually experiencing psychological safety, or top down safety, as I call it, as well as bottom up safety or neurobiological safety that begins to completely shift the way that we show up in our lives, in our leadership, in our work, and with each other. So, why is this important? It's important because of the concept of neuroception and self regulation, as well as co regulation. Neuroception is a concept from Dr. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory. It means that we unconsciously pick up signals of safety or threat. When we don't feel safe, our brain shifts into survival mode, and it's much harder to engage or collaborate. Now, as leaders, we must be aware of how our presence and approach impact others and their nervous systems, because there's a co-regulative effect that we can have, or that we do have, on each other. When we're calm and present, we feel others are safe as well. And when we're not calm and present, we can also create a dissonance with people that we don't intend to. Now, with the SOP3, this is a fundamental tool to begin to self regulate. And it also invites engagement with other people that will create a co regulative space as well. This is key to being able to access the parts of our brain and the parts of our neurobiology that supports creative problem solving, collaboration, as well as social connection, as opposed to being in a reactive state or sensing neurobiological threat and shutting down those parts of our brain. Now, the interesting thing is that that is going on, that neuroception is going on below our awareness. You can't actually think your way out of being dysregulated. And the things that dysregulate us or activate that system can vary widely from person to person. Even an assessment at work or judgment from somebody can activate a signal of threat, which shuts people down in their ability to be able to collaborate or support you in what you want to do. What, so what, and now what? So, what we're actually saying is that a safety reset and culture starts within each person. And what's important is for us to let go of our agendas and let go of trying to get things done first and foremost and connect as people before content. So that we really want to remember relationships before results. The reason why that's important is because as you connect within yourself through presence, listening, and powerful questions or curiosity, it helps you to self regulate and it also helps you to notice other people differently. And then, interestingly, there is a space that opens up so that people can begin to step into that as well. This was the source of a huge transformation for my relationship with my daughters, as well as the relationship with my team, because I started to notice as I practiced being present and listening and those powerful questions, it actually forced me into self-regulation and addressing the internal unaddressed anxiety that was going on for me that I wasn't even aware of. And that angst that I had that really was driving my career as well as my personal relationships. So my professional relationships and my personal relationships. So there was like this tone, this edge and energy with me that people got. And I was so confused by that for so many years. And then when I began to address that and generate a safe space for me, where I could actually give myself what I needed and wanted in moment by moment practice, I started to notice something that just blew my mind. It literally created a space where people experienced me differently. And when they did, they began to respond to me in a different way as well. The bottom line is people began to feel safe with me. And when my daughters started to feel safe with me, even though they were teenagers that were experimenting and going through their own journey, they started to confide in me. They started to ask me questions. They began to come towards me in a fundamental way, so much so that some of my friends that saw what was going down were like, they were asking me, how are you doing that? Because my teenagers don't do that. I want my kids to actually ask me questions like that. And so that was such a huge shift, and it filled my heart with a lot of joy because I had been trying to get that with all of my effort and logic and data and just good arguments before, and it never worked. And now, by putting myself at the top of my take care of list, my to do list, by giving myself that regulation and being present and listening and powerful questions, that was generating this byproduct space where people began to feel safe around me. And that started to give me a foundation to work on that was so different than I had previously had, that it gave me all of the things that I longed for with my daughters. And then when I did the same thing with my team as well, we actually created a safe space meeting where we did exactly the same thing. We were present together. We listened to one another. We asked powerful questions. We let go of having to have all the solutions and started to listen in a more supportive way. And what generated in that space was this support system that totally blew my mind. People started to have each other's backs. The complaints and the criticism started to go down. The interpersonal conflict started to go down, and all of the things we were trying to get from a safety perspective were becoming easier the operation was becoming easier, and people were going home with energy and gas in the tank to live their lives. So people came back after doing this for several months and they said, listen, my wife, my husband told me, whatever you guys are doing in that Zen meeting, don't stop, because you're a different person when you come home. You're more present, you're more available. When that happened, I knew that I had tapped into something inadvertently through my own sort of struggle that was really serving people in a much more fundamental way than just, providing a place for people to work. We were actually creating a support system for people to be their best at work and at home at the same time, so that people got up in the morning and wanted to go to work. They felt safe when they got there. And then when they went home, they had energy to live their lives because they were doing something meaningful for them at work and supportive. Well, long story short, that's why I left the corporate world, because I wanted to do this kind of work with other people, especially those that work in high pressure, high stress environments, because that to me, um, is really difficult. I've worked in that kind of an environment my whole life. I've had that kind of an environment personally and professionally. And then I noticed that, people that have chosen to serve others in sectors like healthcare have really done that with a heart that wants to serve and help and do meaningful work and make a difference in people's lives. And then they go to work and they're so distracted by the systemic distress that's there. And so it became really clear for me once I sort of was led into healthcare. That's a whole other story I won't get into today, but I arrived in healthcare realizing, man, I have actually been prepared for this my whole life. And now I have something that I can share with leaders and teams that will be really impactful, that will help them. And so as a result of all of that, now I'm really excited to share that I'm just about to begin clinical I'm just about to begin graduate research that explores this in a master's program, in a thesis that I've created that explores the efficacy of safe space systemic coaching for leaders and teams, and whether or not it's possible for us to take systemic distress and transform that into energy and well-being, care, and trust on a team. And so I'm excited to say that I'm in the middle of the process of the ethical application for that. And in the next couple of months, I'll be launching that research project with 4 teams, and really, really looking forward to what we discover and learn, and how on the other side of that, we could iterate it and make it even more accessible to more people. So I'm looking forward to that, and I wanted to share that as well. So I hope that you've enjoyed today. And if you look at the what, so what, now what, the now what of this is really to then look at whether it's your next meeting, a conversation that you're having with somebody at home or at work, to really slow down to the speed of your presence. I call it's the SOP3 for standard operating procedures. Of course, everybody knows that acronym, right? But this is actually about slowing down to the speed of your presence. It's a different kind of SOP. And when you slow down to the speed of your presence, you're doing that intentionally, being present in the middle of times when you feel activated, in the middle of times when you've got criticism or complaint or condemnation language going on inside of you. Instead of doing anything or saying anything, my invitation to you and my call to action for you is to slow down and actually take a deep breath into your belly. And as you breathe into your belly, as you take that breath, listen deeply to what you can notice that's going on within you and around you. And still the invitation is to say nothing. This was so hard for me at first to keep my big mouth shut, but it really, really was over and over again what I had to practice, because as I was present and I listened, all of a sudden I noticed so much more information that I could become curious about, like genuinely curious about, for me and for other people. And when I asked questions that were powerful and that let go of an agenda or trying to get something or go somewhere, that changed the dynamic of the whole space and the relationship that I was in at any given moment, the conversation, the meeting that I was in. So that's my invitation. In your next meeting or conversation, breathe and pause first. Listen deeply, focus on the person, not just the words, and then let go of your agendas and judgments and be curious. So that's your now what? In your next meeting or conversation, breathe and pause. Number 2, listen deeply, focus on the person, not just the words. Let go of your agendas, number 3, and judgments, and be curious. All right. Thank you so much for being here and for reviewing this. I hope that it served you. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me on LinkedIn and I'd be glad to answer those. Otherwise, as you leave here, remember to be a safe space, especially for yourself. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you again for getting to the end of this podcast. And if you enjoyed this and you found that there was value in it for you, my invitation is for you to subscribe for future episodes that come out weekly on Tuesdays. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to being with you next time. Now remember to be a safe space.